Welcome to the Stepmom Side with Alicia Crasco, the podcast for stepmoms ready to create the life they want and one they actually have a say in. Here we talk all things stepmom life and just a little bit more. Leave the superficial conversations at the door and get ready for perspective shifts and actionable advice to help you on your way to creating the life you want, one step at a time. Hi, Liz. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to have you because like I was telling you, you're the only person that I've actually interviewed that I know like in real life. So if
I
you're
know.
listening to this, like this is Liz, my friend, literal friend, like she's my real life friend, like we get together. So my audience, I'm sure, does not know you at all. Can you tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, so I am Liz Lombard. I'm a pediatric occupational therapist and I specialize in sensory processing needs. And I started the sensory concierge a couple years ago so that I could support families through a coaching-based model. So, not everyone can afford to do outpatient therapy. A lot of times it's not covered by insurance. And sometimes it's also just not the right fit for your family, whether it's just too much to drive there or you're going to an outpatient clinic to practice being able to do the things you do at home instead of just doing them at home. So I do a coaching based model to support families through trying different strategies, helping educate families about sensory processing disorder or sensory processing differences. And I also really, my kind of major focus is making sure that families can go do special things together. So go see a show, go to a dance recital, go on special vacations to theme parks, or, taking like a long road trip, even those things that can feel so overwhelming when you have kids, just helping parents navigate that, especially when there are sensory processing challenges present.
Okay, I love that. And my listeners obviously don't know this, but like your background is dancing and singing and shows and all of that. So I love
Yeah.
that you started with that, like sing a show or like a dance class or something. Okay, so if somebody's listening to this and they're like, I don't even know what a sensory
Yeah.
processing disorder is, like, can you talk to us about that?
Absolutely. So we all have sensory processing skills that we're using constantly. If you just stop and think about like I'm looking at your face right now and I'm listening to the words you're saying. So there's auditory input, there's visual input, there's background noise in my house. I can feel my sweater kind of swishing against my skin. So there's some input there. There's all this different sensory stimuli that your brain is constantly processing and basically deciding, okay, should I notice this or should I ignore it? Is it important or is it not important? So if you hear a siren go by, your brain is probably going to notice it for a second and then let it go. But if your air conditioner is humming in the background, you're probably not going to think about it or hear it. So our sensory system is really closely linked to our emotional regulation system. And I say that because when we think about our little kids who are learning to get those emotions regulated, the sensory piece can play into that. So if there's a lot of sensory information coming in, then it kind of overwhelms the limbic system and then you can't regulate your emotions.
I feel that
Um,
as a mom.
yeah, yes, 100%, right? And I should say too that I'm a mom of 4-year-old twins. So like the house is noisy
Yeah,
and the kids are noisy and I can't think
process.
straight. Right, exactly. You can't and you truly can't access the frontal part of your brain to be able to say like, okay, I need to do this, I need to do this. That's why life is so chaotic as a
Right?
parent. And then there are some kids who we talk about their neurological threshold. And that means that, so if you have a low neurological threshold, that means that you only need a little bit of sensory input to notice something. And then any more than just a little bit is going to feel like too much. So suddenly the sweater that's swishing against my skin when I walk is overwhelming because my brain is noticing it like, this is an emergency, pay attention to this. Um, and similarly, like if the lights might be too bright because I have a low neurological threshold and this is exceeding it and it's everything is overwhelming and it's too much input. Or the opposite can happen. This is what's tricky about sensory processing needs is they can vary so wildly from child to child, from situation to situation. and for various types of sensory input like auditory, visual, tactile, which is the touch system, even your smell system. So if you have a high neurological threshold, you're the type of person who needs a lot of input before you notice something. And so these kids might have like their shoes are untied and their sweaters like falling off their shoulder and they're not noticing, and it becomes an issue if they're tripping over their shoelace or bumping into kids and not realizing it. Those are the kids that get mislabeled as a bully a lot of the time because they don't even realize they're like throwing their body around.
Like it's interesting.
So yeah, so there's all these, and the thing too is, and then you have kids who are in the realm of what's typical, but might have just some sensory preferences, or because they're young, the environment can be kind of overwhelming. Like automatic flushing toilets are something that a lot of children
Yes.
absolutely hate. And it doesn't mean that your kid has some sort of sensory processing disorder or anything. It could just be that that is so noisy and unexpected that it's really uncomfortable for them. And we all have sensory preferences like that. Like, I would not enjoy going to a Metallica concert.
I
It
could
would
see
be too loud, too noisy. But yes, going to a musical, I would love. That's the perfect
right.
level for me.
Yeah. You and I are the
Yeah.
same. It's funny because and we've talked about this before, like in real life, but I didn't realize how, even like having stepkids, I didn't realize how overwhelming having my own kid would be.
Yeah.
And so as you're like talking through these things, I'm like, oh, you know what? They're like the tactile part. I'm like, oh yeah, there are times where I'm like just the sensation of whatever is too much. And
Hmm.
I don't want this touching me anymore. I can't do it. And I
Well,
didn't go ahead.
yeah, when your kids are young and they're climbing all over you all the time, that's
Mhm.
a lot of input to your system that you're not used to getting. When are you constantly being like brushed all over? Like that sets your brain off. And I think it's important too. And there are a lot of actual coaches out there who focus on sensory processing for parents. And it's interesting, as a quick tangent, a lot of what my work ends up being is helping parents start to see their own sensory needs because they see them in their kids and they say, oh, well, that was me too growing up. And I still have XYZ, whatever it is. I still hate the way that that kind of material feels. But as we mature, we learn to advocate for ourselves and we get to decide what we wear and don't wear, or where we go, or the things we do.
Mhm.
So, um, but yeah, so a lot of times when we as parents can recognize what our sensory needs are and we can start to meet those and just keep ourselves regulated, it just really helps us to handle our own kids. Because, and I swear, biologically, we are wired to have a bigger reaction to the sounds of our child crying than just a random child crying. So when our kids are whining and crying, it really does send our brain, it starts to get into that fight or flight response. And that's why it feels so awful. And that's why we end up snapping at our kids when it's the last thing we want to do.
Yeah. And it is funny that you say, you've got this biological sense to like react to your own kids, right? I will say your daughter sometimes sounds like my daughter. And so when
Yes.
like we've been together and they're talking, I'm like, oh, she's not talking to me. She's talking to you. That's
Right.
your kid. But yeah, I think that it's a lot to process as a parent. And I had no idea because with my stepkids, like they would be gone half the week and then they're here but I could kind of check out, right? Because they're not mine. But then with my own daughter, like I'm the default parent and that's a whole thing, right?
Yeah.
But
Yep.
it's it's a lot to process. And even this morning I texted my husband and said, this is a total side tangent too, I can only be hit and kicked so many times.
100%. Oh yeah, absolutely.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
lose it. I'm like, we're just getting dressed, and it was, can you help me put my shirt on? Of course, I can help you put your shirt on. And then it's play because I try to play with her as much as possible. And then
Hmm.
it was an accident, but I had already been hit and kicked a bunch of times, and she like kneed me in my jaw, and so my like teeth chatter, right? And like we're trying to get out the door, and I was like, okay, where everyone's taking a break. I don't really like to be hit and kicked, and I've met my threshold. It's 7:37 in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
My threshold.
Mm-hmm.
And so then like the tears ensue because but I want you to get me dressed. It was an accident. And I'm like, I understand that it was an accident, but my body is starting to feel like that flight or fight mode. And so right now I need to fly away from you. Like I just need a little bit of
Yeah.
space. I'm going to give
Yeah.
you some timer. You and Kitty can get dressed because she got a stuffed cat. Like you and Kitty can get
Oh.
dressed and then come on down. But it's funny because as you're talking about like the parents and, processing them through like their processing disorders, do you ever have a family show up and you're like, okay, are you here today for the kid? Or are you here today for you?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think sometimes it's so hard. And I became such a better therapist when I became a parent
Mhm.
because I mean, and it's poor young Liz just didn't know. But before I had
You don't know,
kids,
you don't know.
yeah, I know. And I would give parents like, here's a list of strategies to try. And like, who has time for that? And so much of what I do is it's really individual because it's like, okay, walk me through what your morning looks like. And morning is such a, oh my God, it's having to be somewhere at a certain time is inherently stressful. And then when you're trying to get yourself ready and the kids ready, and there's, so many things to think about, that's a lot of mental overload for yourself as a parent. And then that's the time when, if you're thinking about it from a sensory point of view, all kids have a need for, some movement throughout their day. And right in the morning, they probably haven't had that movement. And we're asking them to do something that's challenging because they're still learning how to get dressed.
Mhm.
Um, we're asking, which includes, like there's fine motor skills involved in that. There's gross motor skills and balance. There's sequencing and executive thinking skills involved in all that. So we're asking our kids to do all this on a timeline. We're also trying to get ourselves out the door. So a lot of times I ask parents, what does the morning look like? And we start to really tease it apart with what the parent is doing and then also what behaviors the child or children are exhibiting. And I try to very gently help parents see when their own sensory needs and when their own regulation needs are actually ending up making things worse,
Mhm.
and helping them see that you have way more control over your own sensory system than you do your child's system. So let's get you regulated before we worry about regulating your child. And sometimes, luckily more and more people are practicing things like mindfulness, or a lot of times parents recognize that they need a little bit of movement, so they get up early and work out or do yoga or something before their day starts. And so a lot of times parents will quickly pick up on, oh yeah, okay, here are the things I need to do. Um, and then it starts to be like, okay, so what can we tweak in your morning routine for your child to help them get their sensory needs met, and to also maybe look at things that might be challenging for them and finding a way to change or accommodate those things. Like if a specific texture is really overwhelming, you know, there I've had it's funny, I've had students, or I say students because I work in the schools too. I've had children who have to wear long sleeves all the time, and I have had children who've needed short sleeves all the time. And it becomes, okay, well, when can we just let that go? Like, can we be okay with the kid wearing short sleeves while it's still 60 degrees out? We can be okay with that. And when we know, okay, it's too cold and we're going to wear a jacket, what strategies can we try to get that kid regulated and feeling good before they have to put on that coat that might be uncomfortable for them, if that
Got
makes
it.
sense.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. So I guess like let me back way up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
How do you like as a parent, how do you recognize the signs of there is a sensory processing disorder?
I mean, I think it's so hard because a lot of times it's, without getting too much into it, it's hard because I think a lot of us, when we were kids, were told to kind of like ignore and push through discomfort
That's pretty relatable.
to, so we're used to that. And so when our kids don't want to get out the door, um, we say, we're like, what are you doing? You're doing this on purpose. And so it's hard to be able to start to tease out, okay, my kid is doing this to get a rise out of me versus, oh, my child is uncomfortable. And I think that if we can think about that word uncomfortable, like just taking a mental second to say, is this situation uncomfortable for them? Is there something that's uncomfortable that's bothering them? And then we can say, they wouldn't choose to act like this. They wouldn't choose to be tearful over getting dressed. So there's got to be something going on. And what could it be? And, a lot of times, and like I mentioned, the thing that's tricky about sensory is there can be some kids who are intense sensory seekers where they're constantly, so their morning routine, they might be bouncing all over the walls and they can't just stand still long enough to brush their teeth versus there might be some sensory avoiders who getting dressed is so uncomfortable and so they just don't want to do it, but it's not their body seeking movement, they're avoiding the feeling, the sensation of getting dressed or whatever it is. So there's sensory seeking and sensory avoiding, and that can make it. And then there's a lot within there because you might be avoiding visual input but seeking auditory input. So it gets really tricky. So it really comes down to ruling out, my child's not choosing to do this because they want my attention, and noticing that it's consistent from setting to setting. My child really refuses to wear this sweatshirt no matter where we are, no matter how cold they are, or even like when you think about eating and foods, the textures. If you have an incredibly picky child where they're eating so selectively that they truly can only eat one type of chicken nugget, one brand, and it has to be prepared the exact same way, and you're seeing, maybe their weight isn't where it should be. When you start to see those things where it's like it's not their choice, it's something that their body needs, and so they're either avoiding or seeking whatever that input is. And it's all happening without conscious thought, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And it goes back to that, like we were taught to just like shut up and color kind of thing. And
Yeah.
where now like we live in a world where, okay, I can take the time and listen to you, or, we're moving towards that. Not everyone does it, but like I can take the time and listen to you. Like, what is wrong? Like, what are you struggling with? Like, talk to me, like, let's have a conversation. And that's interesting about the like seeking or like avoiding. I've never really thought about that. So what I'm hearing is like you want to look for patterns in your child's
Yes.
behavior. And for me, I'm like, it looks like I'll be journaling this. Like I'm gonna write down like at this
Yes.
time every day, and like just so you can get something like a concrete, like this is what's happening, like picture.
Exactly. And that's usually one of the first things. So when I start working with a family, we talk about the parts of the day or different places that are difficult, and we'll really kind of break down what's going on. And then it becomes about tracking that and collecting data on what your child is doing and what behaviors they're exhibiting in different situations and when there's different environmental stimuli. And then using that to figure out, oh, okay. And sometimes it's that their system, by 1 or 2 in the afternoon, they're physically tired. And so then they just can't handle a lot of things. And so there's there's sort of a sensory issue, but it's actually more related to something biological, that they need more rest and need to find a way to get rest earlier in the day. Or sometimes it's, oh, well, they're exhibiting these behaviors after we've been, we have a long drive on these days of the week when we're going to and from soccer or whatever. And that's when I'm seeing it, is after they've been sitting in a car for a long time and haven't been able to move. So just finding those patterns is huge. And the other thing too is that helps you if it's not sensory, if there's something else going on, you'll see that too. You'll see like, oh, they're doing this because they want my attention. And that's not a bad thing. Kids do that because they want connection with an adult, and that's information that tells you, okay, I need to find a way to give my child more one-on-one attention. And I mean, that's so much easier said than done.
Right? Oh my gosh,
But
yeah.
it's still information, or you start to realize like, oh, they're doing this around meal times because they're hungry. I mean, so even if you, and sometimes that happens. Sometimes it's as simple as, okay, so their sensory needs aren't that big, but they're showing up when, when their needs aren't met, whether it's not enough sleep, not enough food, not enough attention, whatever that is.
Oh, that's really interesting because, yeah, I would say after dinner, I feel like my daughter gets like the zoomies. And so my
Mm-hmm.
husband and I have like this look, and we're like, she has to go to the bathroom. And no, but I don't. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
but you do. And then 5 minutes later, she's like, guys, I have to go to the bathroom. I'll be right back. And I'm like, yeah, like you can see it, like you just recognize it. And it's, it is really interesting to think about them as almost like a subject that you're studying because like I know that sounds
Yeah.
terrible, but like I
No,
like
no.
it because you just really get to know them and like what
Yeah.
they need. And sometimes it is hard to take off the overwhelm of like whatever is happening and just kind of like slow down and like be in that moment of okay, I'm dysregulated right now, but I also have to like regulate enough to figure out what in the world is going on here. And I'm trying to meet the needs of you. And like in your situation, like the both of you, because I don't even know what's happening.
Exactly.
So if you've got a family that is a family of multiples like you, like what do you recommend if there is some sort of sensory processing? Because I'm sure it's not the same.
Yeah.
The kids are going to be different,
Yeah, and
probably.
that's the first thing I go to is understanding kind of their needs as individuals, and then
Mhm.
from there understanding their sensory needs as a dynamic, because
Oh, interesting.
they are with each other constantly, and so they're kind of, so for an example, my daughter just in general has always been more sensitive to sound, and so when my little boy gets upset, it immediately sets off my daughter because it's noisy, he's crying, and she's also emotionally upset that her brother's upset. So it's just something to be aware of, that if I can put her in the other room, let her listen to music, give her headphones, or separate them somehow so that she can get a little distance and not hear that sound as loudly,
Mhm.
that's going to help calm her down, and then I can focus on him, because it's obviously it's not ideal when they're both losing it.
That's
So
a
it
lot.
just,
Yeah.
yeah, so just, and being mindful too of what the home environment looks like and the environmental stimuli there versus when you're out in the community versus when you're at school, because one thing that happens, well, a lot is families will say that their child has all these sensory needs and at home, but then at school the teachers say everything is fine and there's no issues, and it drives you crazy as a parent to be like, what do you mean everything's fine? It doesn't
My
seem
kid?
fine here. Right. Exactly. But it's actually, the school environment. And sometimes the opposite happens too, where a child, a lot of times when it's, an only child at home is quiet and calm.
Mhm.
And then they go to school, which is totally overwhelming. And that's where they might have some sensory needs present. But then there are a lot of kids who home is kind of crazy, kind of chaotic, not very predictable. The routine can vary so much day to day, and school is a little bit more predictable, really clear expectations and patterns of expectations. And then it's when they come home afterwards that they might sort of lose it a little bit with the family, with the parents. Um, so just thinking about those different situations and what kind of stimuli they're being exposed to in different environments.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about, say, I love this dynamic. I mean, to a degree, right? When your kid is at school and everything is fine and they come home and they lose it.
Yes, yeah, it's so common. It's so common. And again, it doesn't even necessarily mean that there's a sensory processing issue or that there's a disorder or anything. It's that our kids are, I mean, one, they're used to self-regulating with us, and whoever the default or primary parent is the person that they feel safest with and
Mhm.
who they rely on the most to co-regulate with. So we talk about self-regulation all the time, but we don't really fully self-regulate until, I mean, you're not 100% independent with self-regulation until you're in your 20s and your frontal lobe is completely finished developing. But, as a teenager, you need a lot less help in self-regulating. But when you're young and that frontal lobe is still like very much being developed, you need a lot of co-regulation, meaning you need calm adults around you to help walk you through what you're feeling. And that's, you're processing a lot when you're a little kid, and you're processing the environmental sensory stimuli, but you're also processing, I'm in a new place, I'm being asked to do new things, I, am trying to make friends and understand what that means. So that's a lot. And so a lot of times, a lot of times, kids will get through their school day and they'll be okay. And then they're with their safe person and they've been holding it together so hard that they lose it. And it's so funny to me because there are some days where it's in the parking lot that my kids lose it.
Oh,
I'm
that fast.
buckling
Okay.
them in. Yeah, I'm buckling them in and they're losing it. And it's just that, and it's, of course, it's not fun to be the
Yeah.
person that they lose it with all the time, but that's our job. And and I have to remind myself all the time that it is our job to be the calm person in that moment. And I almost have to compartmentalize for myself. And I think I might have told you this. I always imagine, because it's what you do, I imagine like being on an airplane and being the person saying like, okay, there might be some turbulence, but it's okay. Like that
Yeah.
calm voice.
Yeah.
That's how I talk to myself and say like, all right, they're losing it because you're their mom and they're supposed to lose it with you. This is what they're supposed to be doing. You're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Like, it's okay. We're going to get through it. But it's
Hopefully.
very common. Yeah, I know. I know. And the other thing too, and I wanted to say, so you did a really good job when you gave that example of your daughter accidentally kicking you and she's getting dressed. You did such a good job of saying, you know what? I need to take a step back. I need to take some breaths. We're going to put up a timer. So you were modeling self advocacy so that you could self regulate. And that is huge because you're teaching her that she can say to someone else, you know what? I need a minute. This is not comfortable for me, or I got hurt and I need some time. I'm going to step back. And that's what I try to think of with my own kids when I start to lose it.
Yeah.
I say, you know what? I raised my voice, or I'm noticing that I'm not being very kind right now. And I think that I need to take a few deep breaths, or I think I need to step into the other room, or just modeling for them those things that we're doing for ourselves so that they can do that for themselves one day too.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And it is really hard when your blood is boiling to be like, "Hey, I'm starting to lose it." And and I have said that like, "Hey, I'm going to go into the other room. Oh, I'm going to come with you." And I was like, "No, you're not."
You are absolutely not coming with me.
Yeah, no. And I love the dynamic of like being my daughter's safe person and like having like that bond because I didn't have that. But then also I don't love that. I don't love
I
being the person
know.
that like gets the like flip out. So this morning, like a funny story, where she's, now she's getting herself dressed and she's getting kitty dressed. And so she brings like her little stuffed kitty like under her arm downstairs. And I say, "Oh, good morning, kitty." And she goes like deadpan. He doesn't like me. I'm gonna try to tell you this without laughing, but she goes, "He doesn't like you."
Oh my gosh.
And I'm like, "Well, why doesn't he like me?" And she's like complete deadpan. This kid is like freaking hilarious. He doesn't like you. I'm like, "Well, why doesn't he like me?" And you're not part of his family. I'm like,
Oh my God.
she's the mom, but I'm not part of the family. I'm like, "Well, if you're the mom, I would be the grandma." You're not though. He just doesn't
Oh
like.
my gosh.
I'm like, that is hilarious.
Wow.
So like, yeah, like advocating for like herself or like for her kids thing, like she's like definitely there, which is like a blessing and a curse, right?
Yeah, it absolutely is.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, because one of my followers had asked this on Instagram. What tips or tools would you recommend for somebody that's got ADD or ADHD, whether it's a toddler or an adult?
I think, the biggest thing when there's ADD, ADHD, I mean, obviously if you have that diagnosis, you're working with your pediatrician, making sure that the whole team is part of that conversation. So, your kid's teacher at school or preschool teacher or anyone who's working with your kid or nanny, you want them all on the same page to understand, that ADD and ADHD are both, there can be the sort of like all over the place, not focusing on something, but there can also be the sort of hyper focus that can come
Yeah.
with that.
Hmm.
And so for younger kids, really young kids, you just want to help them sort of understand what their impulse control is and what that looks like. And even playing games like red light, green light, or freeze dance, just to help them practice, like, oh, you did a really good job stopping yourself and controlling yourself. And then as they get older, helping them understand that they can really take charge of their own executive functioning by kind of staying on top of organization and coming up with an organization system that works for them. And that's something that, you can work on with your school team as well. Whether that's, we keep notes in this really specific place, or the teacher is providing an outline for the notes that we're going to fill out. And then also making sure that child is part of like checking into that system and checking on, okay, did I do this? Did I finish this? Is my work done? Having like a checklist and visuals is really helpful. And then when you think about adults, kind of similarly, making sure that we have an organization system for ourselves that meets our needs, setting timers when we need to, and reminders on our phone is so, so helpful. And I've even had children, like elementary school children, who we've bought like special timers for, that you can set like 5 or 6 timers throughout the day.
We literally
And
go by
because
timers here.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And so these timers are great because you can set like 6 timers, but it's not, I'm not going to give a kid a smartphone.
Yeah.
But this is something that they can use to make sure, because even sometimes it's as simple as like, oh my gosh, I haven't eaten in 5 hours because I
Mhm.
was so focused on what I was doing that I forgot. And so making sure that you have sort of those systems in place to help make sure that you're getting everything done that you need to get done.
Yeah, and I think those translate well to adults as well,
Yeah.
because the timers are awesome for my daughter to like keep it on track, but they're also like amazing for me to like keep things on track. Whether I am setting up a timer, you've got 5 more minutes of play, whatever that looks like before bedtime. And then I'm like, okay, I've got 5 more minutes of freedom, or I've got 5 more minutes
Hmm.
to finish up the dishes or whatever. And then, but it's like the accountability of it too. Like the structure, like this is happening. Like that is your
Hmm.
cue. Bing, 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 bing. The timer goes off. Okay, now everyone knows what we're doing. It's setting that expectation.
Yep.
But yeah, I use that sometimes, not as often as I should, like in my own like personal life, like outside of my kid. But I'm like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, like for time blocking, that's really great. These hours I'm doing this, like that's super amazing. So I love
Yeah.
that tip because yeah, it works wonders at our house. And I'm sure it works amazing for you guys too.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and it's so important to remember too that like as a parent, you are juggling so much, and your environmental stimuli, there's a lot coming in and it's so overwhelming. And so even there's so many parents who don't find out that they have ADD or ADHD until they're parents, because
Mhm.
it's when their life is kind of thrown into chaos, that's
Mhm.
when they discover like, oh, this is really difficult for me. And having those systems in place can be such a huge difference. And then making sure that you're incorporating movement throughout the day, because that, like we talk about heavy work, which is proprioceptive input. It's anytime you're pushing or pulling on the joints. That type of work is very organizing for the central nervous system. So it helps keep you regulated and keep you focused on what you're doing too. So that can be really helpful for all ages.
Yeah, I know we've talked about it before. Like running is like the go-to for like the stress relieving.
Yeah. 100%. And I know you know that I am a singer and dancer and actress in a past life, but singing even is
Yeah.
so there's so much input that your body gets from that. I mean, if you think about like the abdominal pressure while you're singing, and the input to your jaw and your and in your throat when you're singing, it actually is like a very calming activity too. And it's just so finding those things for yourself, whether it's something like singing or yoga or playing, playing a sport or something, finding those things that work for you and getting them into your day and kind of breaking up your day with some different types of sensory input can be so important to keep yourself regulated as a parent.
I didn't even think about that, but so my daughter does sing a lot, like when she's playing by herself, because when you're talking about
Mm-hmm.
the only child, yeah, I was like taking note. Yeah, when she's here, like it's quiet, she's the one that's kind of like in charge of the play area, play space. And when she goes to school, like the teacher's like, oh, she's a little quiet. She comes out of her shell sometimes, but she's a lot more quiet. So everything you were saying there checks out. But when she's here, um, sometimes she sings by herself, which is kind of cute. But then
Mm-hmm.
I notice if I've got music on in the house and I'm singing along with it, I feel better.
Mm-hmm. Oh
And I
yeah.
never thought about
Yeah.
it like that.
It really does. I mean, and there's evidence that it stimulates the vagus nerve, which is, that's sort of the main pathway, and it's a big part of our fight or flight system. So when you can stimulate that, you can really help regulate yourself. But it's so, and the other thing too is when there's music playing, whether you're just listening or singing along, music is a very predictable type of auditory input
Mm-hmm.
because there's a rhythm and because there are certain musical themes that we expect music to follow. We know there's going to be a verse and a chorus and a verse and a chorus, that type of thing. It actually helps calm us down because it is so predictable. And it's interesting because a lot of kids that have intense auditory sensitivities, they will actually seek out music because it's a type of input that's predictable and calming. And then for those kids where it's really intense, if you try to sing over it, they hate it because you're throwing off the predictability by being the added voice. If that makes
Oh, you
sense.
know what? Yesterday was this
Mm-hmm.
morning when I was taking my daughter to school. That's what she said, don't sing. That's really annoying.
Oh God, she said it's annoying.
Yeah, it is really annoying. And I said, we were just driving down my driveway. And so I just stopped the car like halfway down and I said, listen, girlfriend, this is my car. Granted, and
Yeah.
we were listening to a Coco Melon song, so let's start there, right? Nothing like 8 o'clock in the morning listening to that. But I said,
Oh
listen,
my
like
God.
this is my car. We are listening to your music. I can switch it to my music and then I can sing along. If you don't want me to sing, that's totally cool. But